Great. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm going to introduce myself first. So if you haven't met me before, my name is Jay. My pronouns are they, them. One of the reasons why I like to talk about gender identity and expression is because I myself identify as non-binary, which is under the trans umbrella. And yeah, so I have a lot of lived experience around uh, kind of living as somebody who's gender are different from male or female. And what I've found too, whether it be in the pub or in life or at work in particular, there tend to be a lot of questions about it. And so through my work with the Proud Science Alliance, which I'm one of the co-chairs and one of the programming co-leads, we decided 2 or 3 years ago that we would start offering kind of introductory courses like this one. So that's why I'm here. I work independently, though, as a consultant, really focused around organizational development consulting, coaching, and I do some writing and research in the area of leadership in particular, focusing on those from communities of difference. And I also do some speaking, kind of like this, and other topics as well. And also an artist. I primarily focus on photography. And I'm based out of Southwest Wales, even though I spent almost 20 years in London and the US before that. And if you're interested, just get in touch with me either using the details there on the screen or just through LinkedIn if you would like. So we did welcomes and introductions. I'm going to do an overview of gender identity expression. And the difference that I've never really included here is we did a bit of like a tiny bit of history, but I've added some more in with a scientific focus, really to give some context to what's kind of going on in terms of our own perceptions of gender, but also what we read about, if you're like me, daily in the news, in the newspaper that I tend to read every day. And of course, as we go through, happy to answer questions and that kind of thing, but also I'll point out some additional resources. And yeah, and Katie, as you mentioned, you need to leave, but I'll share these and there'll be the additional resources that you might want to access. Anyone can do that. So with that, let's jump in. And the place I always like to start, particularly because whether, again, it be at the pub or in conversations or when I read about it, is there's this general perception that being genderqueer or outside the gender binary, male, female binary is something that's new. You know, these young kids with their non-binary or other terms that they use, differences in pronouns and stuff, but actually if you look at this map that's created by the UN, in terms of gender identity, but also sexual orientation, it's not new. And here are just some examples from Russia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also the United States and Indonesia. And I won't read through these, but just to point out that in case you haven't come across this, actually, in a lot of indigenous communities around the world, gender is really viewed as sort of a spectrum. I think the one that I hear most of and that I was certainly aware of before getting into understanding a little bit more myself is in the United States. They have communities of people that refer to those across the gender spectrum as two-spirit. You know, individuals who don't identify as male or female or somewhere in between. And so you'll notice if you kind of pay attention or read or whatever, that this concept that gender queerness or the trans identity isn't actually something that's new. And however, today we we have this concept, you know, that it is very binary, that the concept of the gender binary is something that's always been around. And just pause for a second. And the question I always like to ask here is, why is that? You know, if historically, reaching back hundreds, even thousands of years, there's always been this continuum. What changed? You know, what were the things that occurred that made it so today that we don't necessarily think of gender as a spectrum, but rather binary? I'm going to help answer that question a little bit. And the way that I'll do that is really talking about gender or sex in terms of evolutionary terms, in terms of science. And so, and this is really a Western view, because most most of the, I would say, communities or people that we reach through the Proud Science Alliance, but also the organizations that we work with have this mindset. So the first stop on this little tour that we'll take is what we term as kind of ancient Greece. And so two philosophers you probably have heard of, Aristotle and Galen, while they were separated by time, in terms of their concept around gender, they were very much aligned, and they really believed that there was no biological divide separating male from female. They had different ways of explaining it, but even back in those days, there was this generally accepted concept that gender was a spectrum. So let's fast forward a little bit, really to the Middle Ages, and really from the years 500 to 1500 or so, there was this prevailing belief, again, that gender was a spectrum. And I think when you think about what was going on at that time scientifically, probably not a lot. A lot of it was like this blending of religion, mysticism, spirituality, and science. And then, in fact, that existed back in Aristotle and Galen's day as well. But the point here is that the way that they explained it is that there was a difference in heat across a woman's uterus, and so depending on where kind of the baby was or whatever, then they came out either fully feminine or fully masculine, but there was this continuum in between. So again, what shifted? And I think what happened was during the Renaissance, some of what occurred, of course, we know that within the Renaissance there was a kind of an explosion of art and culture and things like that, but also science. And so there was a little bit more attention being paid to what was going on. Still, they didn't have the means that we have today to really examine the body in the way that we do, all the way down to the molecular, submolecular levels. However, they did start to think about what was going on. And I think there was no standard view. And I should point out here that what was different around gender relative to even like something like sexual orientation, that kind of thing. When it comes to gender, there were physical things that you could notice. And what we know today as intersex people, those who are physicians or those who operated in that capacity back in these times, they did notice differences. So medically, there wasn't necessarily a universal view of how people described it. However, what was happening politically and also within the religious context and in different, I guess, areas, there was a movement more towards protecting the rights of men or man and ensured the male-female divide. And so this makes sense when we think about, if we have any connection back to history, that there was that concept in terms of male ownership of property and those kinds of things across Europe, and then after that into the United States. So then fast forward again into this is the 1830s, where this guy Saint Hilaire was a scientist, and he was part of a group of I would say scientists who really kind of progressed scientific ideas, but also examination in different ways because of what they learned and what they were able to observe. But he founded a new science called teratology, and what that meant is that they studied unusual births across not just humans, but any kind of animals and that kind of thing. The important thing about this is basically the concept developed of noticing that if there was a variance in what they started to describe as normal, that actually it was a problem. So it was an anomaly that could be understood, but also potentially treated and cured. And so if you think about this is just one man, but if you think about who was involved in scientific discovery during that time, and also this idea of the male-female divide, it was men who were involved in these decisions, and basically what they were viewed as is, we are scientists, so this is the truth. So it started to be entered into popular mindsets, I would say, around things like if you are born intersex, that's not normal, so it needs to be corrected. So not too long after that, this guy called Klebs published a work in 1876, and basically his premise were that gonads were the specific thing that defined whether you're male or female, and that's the only thing. And also keep in mind at this time, there wasn't a lot of observation beyond that, because we didn't have the means, as I mentioned before, to look beyond physical features. And so what this meant, though, is that those individuals who had other kind of variations chromosomally, or as we'll kind of talk about, hormonally, or our body's ability to respond to hormones, they couldn't really test that or really even, I guess, acknowledge that. So what that did is by saying that if you had, a certain female or male gonads, that this is the determining factor. What that did effectively is erase a large portion of intersex people, or what we know today as those with different a variety of physical conditions. So that was really significant. What happened after that is there was advancements in terms of how people were able to investigate, including things like biopsies in the early 1900s. So they didn't necessarily discount what Klebs was saying, but they kind of started to expand it out and really thinking about what biologically it meant to be male or female from a sex perspective. And then finally, the last person that I'll mention is this guy Young, considered the father of American urology, and he published this book in 1937. The important thing, even though the intention was really good, again, keeping in mind that there is this idea that if you are intersex or in any way outside of what we would expect in terms of a male or female body, and even as it developed, that there was something that needed to be corrected. And so what he did is publish this book and described both surgically and hormonally treatments that would really fix or treat the body of those people who were intersex. The impact, as we can see across multiple dimensions, that science has on what we think and how we believe is clear here. So there is an evolution of how we think about gender and sex, partly or quite importantly because of science and how it evolved. So that gives you some background, hopefully contextually, that traditionally, there was this gender spectrum. What happened over time is that in the Western context, at least, there were scientists who basically told us, that there is a binary, and then keeping in mind contextually what was happening historically and politically was really important. What the other thing I wanted to mention, because this is important kind of contextually or historically, is that a book report that of somebody I follow on Instagram called Alok Menon, and they're a non-binary poet and writer and speaker and comedian, but occasionally they post things or book reports. This is one that I found really intriguing, and partly because today biological sex is sometimes weaponized. And what I mean by that is that you are not a woman, speaking to a trans woman, because you can't reproduce or give birth. So basically giving biological reasons for excluding trans women as women. What's interesting about this, if you think about historically what's been done using scientists, or science rather, really to exclude or create populations of people and differentiating them. In this context, we've used it against not just white women, but also Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color in different ways, really to marginalize them. And so the second slide there really talks about how science was used in a way to basically, I guess, box in women as your the ones who are here to basically reproduce. That's the primary function of women. We don't believe that anymore, and that's certainly not true, but I think the important part of this is the last sentence there, is that basically if you were a white woman in this case, and you deviated from the intent, or the acceptance or normalization of yourself or your role as a reproductive agent, then there was some sort of pathology involved. You were criminal, you were unsexed, ugly, or abnormal, or in the terms or in the context of queerness, as a lesbian, you are a sexual deviant. So I think it's important to understand contextually what was going on as well from a scientific perspective and how it was used that somehow influences how we view gender today. So let's get into sex and gender then. So what I mentioned is historically science has evolved, so we can look at things like chromosomes, we can look at hormones and our body's response to them. But in terms of sex, how we view it, it is a social designation, but also from a legal and medical perspective. So a baby is born, there's a document that's created, that's a legal document. Medically, we have to kind of define that. And what's really interesting is that we have this system where basically you need to be categorized as male or female. Sometimes we describe it today as assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, AFAB or AMAB. However, even scientifically speaking, there are variances chromosomally. We mentioned gonads before, but also our physical structures and how we basically present in a physical sense, but also from a hormone perspective and our body's ability to respond to those hormones. All of those things matter in terms of what we describe as male or female, or somewhere in between. And in fact, there is a continuum. And it happens a lot more times than you think. About 1 in 100 births, there's not a lot of data, to be fair, on this, because we're so intent on kind of fixing this problem that a lot of times the data isn't even collected, or this problem is corrected in a way without really even recording it. So somebody is recorded as a male or a female, regardless of how their body looks or whatever happens. So that's in terms of sex, and it's not correct even to say that there's either male or female. There is a continuum. And let's talk about then gender. And gender is a construct really in relation to how we interact with other people. We can think about it from a historical perspective, what matters, what has happened, and we touched on that a little bit, but also from a political point of view or an institutional point of view. All of those things matter. And if you think about it in terms of our own consciousness, we even think, like if I mention the color blue, is that a male or a female color? Of course, we know it's neither. However, historically, even politically or socially, there is this, I guess, assignment of blue being for boys and pink being for girls. So these are things we learn and we assign. It's not really scientifically a fact that blue means boy. That's kind of silly if you think about it that way. So when we think about gender, though, gender in terms of our identification is in reality unlimited. And let's talk about why that is. Yes, Katie, you're right. Pink used to be seen as a male color. And so we can think historically how things have changed, and who knows, maybe tomorrow it will be purple or whatever. But yeah, it kind of points out the silliness of it with things that we make up. But the important thing here is that when we think about gender identity, it's our personal sense of our own gender. And what's interesting is I've heard, or I kind of spoke with people and say, well, I don't really think about it, partly because most people, I would say, are, come into the world and they're assigned male or female, and they're like, yes, that's how I identify, that's how I view myself. I didn't personally have that experience ever since I can remember. I never felt like I fit either. And this is my reality, because I can recall specific moments in time when I was very young and thinking, gosh, I'm here with the boys. I don't really fit here. And I didn't necessarily want to be with the girls, although I liked theoretically boy stuff and girl stuff both. I like sports, but like playing with dolls, but I think, so it wasn't until I got to my adult phase when I heard the word non-binary for the first time, honestly, not that long ago. And I thought, finally, something that I can relate to. And so that's how I identify. And it's really here, and that the picture of the brain is because it's like our perception, our personal sense of how we show up in the world. It's important to understand too, gender expression is different, so it's basically how we express gender through our behavior, mannerisms, anything that we are interested in, even our physical characteristics or appearance. My gender expression from a presentation point of view, most people look at me and think because I have a beard, I like to work out. So, you know, that sort of thing. My body's, I guess, more masculine. People view me in my presentation as masculine or male. I do usually have nail varnish on, and it's something I like because I think it's pretty. I like it. But I think in terms of my expression, that's probably the only thing sometimes, that people would point to and say that's weird. Why you're a man, why do you do that? And but there is no limitation here either. So I know a really good friend of mine who's non-binary, assigned female at birth. They are quite feminine in their presentation. We both struggle in the world a little bit because we're definitely genderqueer, but people don't perceive us that way. The expectation is if you're non-binary or whatever, that you're somehow dress or express yourself in between, but there's no expectation that you do that. It's everyone's personal choice. I always like to include sexual orientation here because sometimes people get confused. I've said to somebody, for example, I'm non-binary, and they're like, "Oh, I have a gay friend," which is completely different. Sexual orientation is about who we're attracted to, so that's kind of related to our heart, whereas gender is more mind, if you can think about it in those ways. So I look like this, but I'm attracted to men, or masculinity is the way I would describe it. That's different from my gender identity. That's independent of who I am attracted to. So there are specific identities, gender identities, and they, lots of different terms. In fact, you can make up your own if you like. These are just some common ones that you might have heard about or you might hear. So I talked about non-binary, that's myself. Actually, I prefer the term genderqueer, but when I say that, most people really don't understand what that means. So non-binary, most people kind of get, at least in concept. And so that's the one that I typically use. But the reason why I have transgender bolded there is because transgender basically means outside of the binary. So basically your gender identity is different or trans, um, different than the sex you were assigned at birth. So I consider myself transgender because I was assigned male at birth, but I don't identify as male, so I'm trans. So it can be used as an umbrella term. Most people view that as, well, if you're trans, then you're binary. So you were born male, but your gender identity is female. But there's an expansive way to think about that. The other one that I have bolded there is cisgender. And this basically means if you're assigned male at birth and you identify as male, then you're cisgender. And then there's some other ones there that you can read through. I mentioned two-spirit as one. And yeah, I know people who have identified as agender or gender fluid or even gender questioning. And yeah, so these are just a few that you might run into in here. I think the important point here is one that I've made before. The range of gender identifications is in reality unlimited, so people can define how they want to be called. In fact, that's one of the first principles that I like to talk about. So when it comes to gender, it's really important to understand that I am who I say I am. And I've certainly had people place their expectations on me. Other people have too, but I think it's up to me to define my gender identity and how I choose to express that. There isn't any preconceived ideas. I don't need to fit into anybody's box. I don't think, and as I mentioned before, gender anyway is a construct that we've created, so I think that's what's so hard for some people. It's like this is the truth, but actually my truth may be different from what you consider the norm. So I think when it comes to gender, it's always the best thing to do is just be curious and also accept people for who they are and what they say how they say they identify. The other really interesting thing is that gender identity can change over time. And you're like, how is that possible? But I think some people are fluid. And I met somebody in Germany, obviously assigned male at birth. They were quite masculine presenting, I would say, but definitely identified as non-binary. But when we were talking, it was at this bar. It just happened to be at this bar, and we ran into each other and found this commonality because we both are kind of beardy and but definitely identified as non-binary. And they said, some days I wake up and I just know I'm a woman, but also likes to present as masculine. So that has something to do with gender expression, but it's also gender identity. So maybe for a day, could be for a week or a month or a year or 10 years. It doesn't really matter. And there are plenty of people who certainly fit into that category. And I'm pretty clear, for myself. I'm non-binary and I've always been that way. But certainly people can decide to change over time and it's not an issue. The other important one is not to assume somebody's gender. I mean, I think, as I described, people assume I am a male all the time, all the time. That's like 99.9% of the time. It's rare that somebody will actually ask or kind of honor what I have to say. I think that's just really important from a workplace perspective, because of names or when you're meeting new people, you can already kind of decide, and I think it's better just to at least be open and maybe just ask them, even if sometimes you're not clear. Some people do express themselves in a very gender neutral way, then it's okay to just say, I'm Jay, my pronouns are they, them, and open up the opportunity for them to, yeah, express what their pronouns might be. Speaking of pronouns, um, most people use he, him, his, or she, her, hers. I think what we're starting to integrate more, and these are my pronouns, or they, them, theirs. And what I wanted to do is just point out that there are others as well. And I think I personally haven't met anyone who uses anything other than he, she, or they, but I've heard stories that some do. And I think it's important to understand why it's important to respect somebody's pronouns. You can think about this for yourself. Imagine your pronouns are what they are, and somebody used different ones. How would that feel? I think for me, when somebody uses he, him pronouns for me, it, I think because I'm so clear about who I am and the pronouns that I use very explicitly, it feels like they don't really see me, or it's I know the intention typically isn't to be malicious, but it feels like slightly disrespectful, particularly people who know me, and I've said to them, my pronouns are they, them. So I think it's just a really easy way to say I see you and I respect you. I think from a human perspective, I think it's really foundational. We all want to be seen and respected for who we are. So I think this is the reason why we use pronouns the way that we do. And just a quick word about transitioning. So this comes up because people almost have this expectation if you're trans in any form that you want to change your body, or that don't you want to be more, like for myself, don't you want to be more non-binary, whatever that means, in terms of expression, that sort of thing, and not necessarily. And I think it's also a very personal decision. So somebody can identify, if they're assigned male at birth, but they identify as a as a woman, they don't even need to change anything about their bodies, because as I've talked about, gender identity is here, so not necessarily in the bodies that we are given, so I think there's plenty of people who've made decisions to transition, make changes to their body, or even and how they dress and express themselves. There's plenty that don't. Some choose to do some things and not other things, but it's very personal, and it's not something that it yeah, and I would say in the majority of cases, the people that I've spoken to, at least, they don't like to be asked about it. There's some that are very open. So I met an activist from Poland, and she is trans, and she's very willing to talk about it, and she's very outspoken, and she's very overt, and she'll just kind of offer information, even in a casual conversation, about being trans and that sort of thing. I would say that's the exception. I think it's just keeping in mind that if somebody is genderqueer, describes themselves as trans, that it's their business about transitioning. It's not an expectation that they would or wouldn't. What I wanted to do is, because we started kind of talking about the history of gender queerness, that it's not new. We talked a little bit about the history of science and the impact that's had on our own consciousness relative to gender. Then some important ways to think about gender and sex, and even some specifics about pronouns and that kind of thing. What I wanted to do is just spend a couple of minutes talking about where are we today. And great. Thanks, Katie, for being here. And yes, you're right. I will get you the recording. Thank you. Yeah, so I think what I wanted to touch on then is, where are we in the world today? This is one survey that was done, and it was across a number of countries, not all of which are listed here. And it's hard to see, but the gray line is basically that worldwide, the average of people who identify as transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or other ways is about 3%. And then there's some different countries there. I included as many as I could because this is a more European focus, and also includes the United States there, but anywhere from 2 to 6% in Switzerland. And then there's other countries where the number is, I guess, lower. But just wanted to give you a sense of, how many people, so it's not insignificant number. Now, there's a group called ILGA, and this is a view of the European continent. This includes, it's not just the EU, but Europe as a whole. And what they do is do an assessment across a number of different aspects of the LGBTQ plus experience, and compare it to basically non-LGBTQ plus human rights. And what I wanted to point out are two specific areas relative to gender. So the green box there, or the green there, is really about legal gender recognition. So in other words, somebody like myself, do I have the same human rights as somebody who doesn't identify as non-binary, or across the trans experience? And across the trans experience, or gender recognition, in terms of human rights, across Europe, the average is 37% out of 100. So that's pretty significant in terms of, having access to legal recognition, protection under the law, that kind of thing. One example is that there's no non-binary recognition within the UK where I live. So even my gender identity isn't recognized from a political or legal perspective. And the reason why that matters, probably in my daily life, maybe not so much, but it does have impact in terms of when I fill out passport applications or things like that. There's no recognition of who I am. And then you can see the other ones listed there, and the impact that has is much deeper. When you don't have access to medical intervention or care, that sort of thing, or even the ability to change your name in some cases. And then the other one I wanted to point out is the blue, and you can see there's not even a number associated with that, because across Europe, the percentage of parity is so low. And really, it's across 4 dimensions, like basically prohibiting medical intervention before a child is able, to have informed consent when they're intersex. In other words, the parents get to decide and make decisions about changing their child's body. And you might think, well, that's a given. They should be able to do that. But it's also keeping in mind that those who are activists in the intersex community advocate for not doing that. Allow the child to grow up and then decide And there's lots of reasons for that that I won't get into today. But I think the reason why that's important is because there's so little protection across Europe. There's only 6 countries where there's either 50 or 60% parity with those who are not intersex in terms of human rights. That means agency over their bodies, but also access to various things. So I just wanted to point that out is where we are today. So why does this matter? Or why, like, how can you bring it into the workplace? And that's really where I wanted to end today, is really think about what it is that you can do in the workplace. One is really to think about this question: what do what do employees really care about? Obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list, but certainly these are really important things, not just from my perspective, but I've interacted a lot within the trans community. And also, this isn't exclusive to trans people, but it's certainly important when you think about gender identity and expression. The first one is, it safe for me to work here? And especially if I'm open about who I am. And I'll give you an example of this. And so I do leadership research. One of the people I interviewed was a young non-binary person from the United States, incredibly smart, I would say reasonable amount of ambition, and they were just starting out in their career. They joined a company, and because of the COVID pandemic, they were working at home like everybody else was. During that time, they chose to change their gender expression, I would say, to be something a bit more gender neutral. And there was worry that as we came out of the pandemic, and that there would probably be an expectation that they would go into the office, that is it safe? Is it safe to fully express who I am and basically dress how I want to and have my hair the way I want to? Or is there going to be a problem for me? So it's a real concern. I think also I've known people who transitioned at work, what's going to happen? Is it possible to realize my ambitions? In particular, for trans people, non-binary people, genderqueer people, all of the terms, do we see others who look like me and express themselves like I do? I think I certainly don't, but I think but we're starting to see that more, where there's good role models and that sort of thing. Within your organization, though, that's important. Visibility is really important. And then will I feel will I be and feel supported to be who I am? And I think this is really important as well. I think on a practical level, then you might be thinking about, what could I do, to be more inclusive? Maybe you're doing these things already, but certainly sharing your pronouns in your email signature, even on your business card, or like we're doing here today within virtual environments, is really helpful because it sends out a signal. I've been asked this question so many times: does it really matter? And it certainly matters to me, because with that little indication, it helps me understand that actually who I'm speaking to is probably safe, and they will understand and actually respect my pronouns for what they are. I think another story that I'll tell really quickly is, like, I was in a corporate environment and I was with a bunch of leaders, and I made the statement that actually, when I see a rainbow lanyard, it's like a signal or indication. Okay, I'm safe with that person. Not that I feel completely unsafe, but I just know that there's that added layer of comfort that actually, okay, it does matter. And I remember months later, maybe even years, one of the leaders that was there recounted that to me. I had forgotten that I said that, but the reason I remember is because she said, I didn't realize that that was so important. I think when we think about things like this, it does matter, to be overt about that. And if you feel comfortable to introduce yourself using your pronouns, that's a great way. If you're meeting somebody, particularly for the first time, oftentimes I'll talk to organizations who, when they're talking about recruitment, of course, recruitment practices are important, but if you're welcoming somebody into your organization, just simply saying your name and your pronouns helps them understand, here we are inclusive. I think also, and I include myself in this, because when I started using pronouns that were other than he, him, she, her, it didn't necessarily come naturally, especially after like 40 something years of living in a binary world and not even understanding that there were other options. So you can practice in a safe environment, and people do that differently. But it usually does help, maybe with friends or whatever works for you. I think the other important thing too is that, in particular, if you have trans people or non-binary people, particularly if they use they them pronouns like I do, watch for incorrect misgendering. And so this has happened with me. I've been in meetings before, and somebody else stepped in and said more than once, that actually Jay's pronouns are they them, just as a reminder. It's super helpful because I usually don't feel comfortable because I don't always want to be the one. As a reminder, it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable to correct people. So even doing that is great um, for those who work around you. And then continue to educate yourself. And there's different ways to do that. I'm going to flash this up because I think this is a list of my favorite resources. And I was just on a call yesterday, in fact, with somebody who had seen this and they watched the Trans 101, the basics, and she said, that was so good. It was great. I agree, but all of them are really good. Most of the ones at the top are quite short, but they're really helpful. And then if you have a bit more time, there's some really good ones. I mentioned Alok uh, because their Instagram I follow in the book report. There's a really good podcast that Alok did. I think it's called the Man Enough podcast, but they were talking about gender identity, and it's a slightly different take, but in a really, really interesting, good way. And so that's a really good one too. But I'll pause there and we'll have some questions. But this is also where I'm going to stop the recording. So I'll just do that first. Go.